This is the War Memorial in Stratford, Ontario, and it's typical of all the war memorials across Canada, in every village, in every town, and in every city. And these memorials are gateways to the First World War. Unfortunately, most Canadians have forgotten the First World War, and they don't realize that it was the greatest and most traumatic episode in our history. 400,000 Canadians went overseas between 1914 and 18, and 60,000 died for King and Empire.
November 11th, 1918. The last guns fall silent on the Western Front. The Great War is over. Delirious with joy, millions of civilians and soldiers surge into the streets. But 9 million men are dead, and 20 million have been maimed. On November 11th, for survivors like Victor Wheeler, 4 years of slaughter have come to an abrupt end.
We troops were suddenly tired and inexplicably drained of purpose and spirit. It was an insipid, stunned feeling, or lack of feeling, like being shocked by a high explosive shell. Who could be expected to feel the joy of peace when our closest buddies were gone? Our scarred minds and hearts wondered what lay beyond the peaceful western horizon. The future for us was but another no man's land, and we were reluctant to go over the top into the treacherous unknown.
By signing the armistice, the German government recognizes defeat. But millions of shocked and bewildered German soldiers simply pack up and head for home. Many swear bitterly they have not been defeated. The armistice is a betrayal.
History will recognize that we fought as no people ever fought before. We stand in the memory of our dead who are holy to us, and we believe ourselves entrusted with the true and spiritual welfare of our people. So long as the blade of a sword will strike a spark in the night, may it be said, Germany lives and Germany shall never go under.
In 4 years fighting, 2 million German soldiers have died. One survivor, stunned by Germany's sudden collapse, is a 29-year-old corporal. When he hears of the armistice, he throws himself down and weeps. His name, Adolf Hitler. When peace is declared, the 100,000 men of the Canadian Corps also receive a shock. They will not be going home. The 1st and 2nd Divisions are ordered to occupy Germany. As they pass over the Rhine, General Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps, takes the salute. With the Corps is Agar Adamson of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
Dear Mabel, all our methods are those of an invading army, less looting and the actual firing of live ammunition. I think the Germans, who have lived in comfort here for years, should all be marched through the devastated parts of Belgium and France to make them realize what the people have suffered. I have not the slightest spark of feeling but that of hate for any German. Ever thine, Agar.
In France and Belgium, the German invasion had laid waste to more than 1,000 square kilometers of countryside, often leaving not a single building standing. And in the fighting, 1,700,000 Frenchmen died, and the British Empire lost over 1 million men.
We're in Loos British Cemetery, one of the 1,000 constructed British Commonwealth war cemeteries in France. And we're here because this is unique in terms of what it represents and how it shows how the cemeteries were designed and laid out during the 1920s. This cemetery itself was only about 40 graves in July 1917. Then after the war, they decided that they were going to bring in all the bodies from the surrounding battlefields. One of the other things that they were working on was, of course, they were all wooden crosses and sometimes private memorials. And one of the first principles of the War Graves Commission was universality of treatment. You can always see, regardless of the rank, regardless of the standing in the community, everyone has the same headstone. The grave here of Lieutenant Hawken, you can actually see what was probably his original stone, but it wasn't permitted to remain, so someone looks like they've broken it off and put it in front of the new headstone. All the soldiers who died in the war and were buried would be put in permanent war cemeteries, so their sacrifice would be remembered forever. And what happened here is, of course, they replaced the cross, the wooden cross usually, with a Portland headstone, and they laid out and landscaped the whole cemetery to look very beautiful.
Even as the bodies are being collected from the battlefields, the ground freezes. It is, many say, the coldest winter in memory. With the winter comes another plague, the Spanish flu, spreading death and fear among the troops crowded in military camps. Transferred to England, Will Byrd and his buddy Tommy celebrate surviving 2 years of the toughest fighting on the Western Front.
Tommy roused me at noon and said he was feeling feverish. I had no luck on the telephone. Always a nurse answered and said the doctors had more than they could handle because the flu epidemic was raging. So out I went and finally found a doctor. He looked a tired man but came with me, and in half an hour Tommy was on his way to a hospital. The next afternoon I tried to visit Tommy. The doctor came back quickly and his message stunned me. Tommy had died that morning. The world crashed around me.
It is a cruel irony. The Spanish flu kills more people than the Great War itself. In a few months, more than 20 million die. It is finally time the government realizes to get the men back to Canada. And commandeering the biggest ocean liners, the Canadians finally set sail, homeward bound. Below deck, trying to sleep, Will Byrd cannot escape the war. It returns as a nightmare.
I seemed to be in an atmosphere rancid with stale sweat and breathing. Then from overhead, the machine gun's note, louder, higher, sharper, as it swept bullets over the shell crater in which I hugged the earth. And again, the long-drawn whine of a coming shell, its heart-shaking explosion, the seconds of heavy silence. Then the first low wail of the man down with a blood-spurting wound. It was too much. I got up and dressed. To my amazement, there were other dark figures near the rail. No one spoke, although we were touching shoulders. All at once, the watchers stirred, tensed, craned forward. It was the moment for which we had lived, which we had envisioned 1,000 times. Far ahead, faint, but growing brighter, we had glimpsed the first lights of home. But those at home would never understand us. Something inexplicable would make us unable to put our feelings into words.
After 4 years, constantly under fire, comforting the wounded and dying, Canon Frederick Scott is badly wounded himself. And it is only in May 1919 that he can return home with the troops.
All along the decks of the great vessel were 2,700 men. On their young shoulders, the burden of empire had rested. Never again will one see the great battalions marching on the battle-plowed roads of France and Flanders. All that is over. I told them what they had done for Canada and what Canada owed them. I asked them to continue to play the game out here as they had played it in France. Then, telling them to remove their caps, I pronounced the benediction, said goodbye, boys, and turned homewards.
Among the boys coming off the ship are 83,000 sick, wounded, and crippled. One of them is Private Donald Fraser. His flesh has been ripped apart by high explosives and his shoulder shattered. He is now a very different man from the proud adventurer who enrolled in 1914. Desperately needing help, he writes humble letters to the authorities, explaining how the war destroyed his health.
From personal experience of shells exploding close to me, the concussion in some cases affected my breathing, which I presume means either a reaction on the lungs or heart or both. Others gave out a deafening report, followed by no effect. The other explosion caused a tremendous outward pull on the tissues of the body, as if something was tearing me apart. And I have the feeling that this condition of aneurysm was caused through that explosion.
Like thousands of returning veterans, Donald Fraser is awarded a pension, $180 a year, enough perhaps to pay 5 months' rent. For the blind, the mutilated, and the amputees, there are meager pensions and rapid courses of rehabilitation. Some are hidden away forever in hospitals. Incurable shell shock victims are consigned to special institutions. Many veterans will live crippled lives and die painful, lingering deaths. Even those lucky ones who come back apparently unscathed carry hidden scars. They never leave the war behind, as their wives and families soon discover.
We are married to shadows, merely walking shadows. The real men died out there somewhere in Flanders. They seem to be hypnotized by the awful horror they have seen. It keeps them forever chained.
In the 1920s, the scars of the Great War are still fresh in the minds of men and in the fields of Belgium and France. For 4 years, the richest countries in the world had used every weapon they could invent, and in a fight to the finish, had saturated every meter of ground with fire. What is left in 1919 is a 650-kilometer-long wasteland of churned-up mud, of trenches, of tunnels, mine craters, rusting snakes of barbed wire, gutted tanks, and bodies. Almost 2 million bodies, lost forever or buried in makeshift graves. Among them, almost 1 million British Empire dead, and 60,000 Canadians.
The battlefield was literally strewn with isolated graves and small cemeteries. So in the post-war years, once they acquired the land, they had labor companies going out and bringing in all the isolated bodies. The labor companies or exhumation companies had an incredibly nasty job because they had to go around and find the graves. Now, they had a registration plan if any of the graves had been registered, but there were thousands, literally tens of thousands of graves that were not registered, and they'd often go digging at one cross and they would find 10 bodies underneath it. And of course, some of these bodies in 1919 would still have flesh on them, and it was just a nasty experience. A lot of the identification was missed because the identification disc would have been driven into the flesh on the impact of the death if it was a ship from a shell, or who knows. So they had a number of schemes they used to use. One was looking for rat holes. Of course, they'd find a rat hole, and if there's any equipment in it, they'd start to dig around it and start to bring out the bodies. And these exhumation companies worked from 1919 to 1921, and they brought in about 125,000 British Commonwealth soldiers. So I'm not counting French or Germans. So these guys were working in horrible conditions and dangerous conditions. Some of the crews were killed. They'd be cooking their tea up over little do they know it, an unexploded high explosive shell.
Even today, the work of clearing the battlefields continues as bomb disposal units gather live shells that continually surface in farmers' fields.
German shells 7 centimeters 7. The British mortar 3 inch. Grenade mills. That's a fuse. Always a grenade. That's 8 inch British shell. So it's firing, we can see it. So it has some small lines. So he went through the cannon. So the fusing system is armed, active, and by the touch of the head, it can explode.
In the Great War, more than 900,000 tons of shells were fired. 30% failed to go off. And now, hidden away, in the quiet woodlands of Belgium and France are dozens of high-security depots, stockpiled with live munitions from more than 80 years ago.
So this is one of the ammunition dumps where the ammunition, the shells that are probably gas shells, are stored. And they're simply awaiting here the right time to be identified, just to make sure that these are actually gas shells, and then they will be dismantled. In this dump we have approximately 10,000 shells. It'll take quite some time to get rid of these shells, and we will be continuing to get rid of the shells because every year we keep finding about the same amount. And for decades and decades now, the number of shells that are found in the fields hasn't changed. So if this has been going on for decades, we may be sure that for the next few decades it'll continue.
Throughout the 1920s, the work of clearing the battlefields of shells continues, as does the even more important work of recovering bodies.
What they ended up with was all these incredible cemeteries. The first principle was universality of treatment. The second was every name was going to be remembered, which is why they have these cemeteries and the memorials to the missing. The third one, and the one that caused the most amount of concern, was that no bodies could be repatriated. So it didn't matter who you were or where you lived. It didn't matter if your son was killed in France, he was going to be buried in France, close to where he fell, and he was going to be buried with his comrades. This caused a lot of grief. You can well imagine what it was like to say goodbye to your husband in 1914 or your brother in 1914, and he never comes back.
One Toronto woman refuses to submit to her loss. Her name is Anna Dury. Her only son, Lieutenant William Dury, had just recovered from severe wounds when he was killed near the city of Lens in France.
What Anna Dury did was she requested politely and correctly a couple times in the early 1920s that her son be repatriated, and she was politely turned down. But she wasn't going to be deterred by this, and she decided in 1925, when the time was right, that she was going to get her son's body home. These men here were all originally buried in Corkscrew Cemetery near Lens. And when the War Graves Commission tried to obtain the land, the owner wouldn't let them have it. So ultimately, they had to exhume all the graves, including Dury's, from Corkscrew and rebury them here at Blues. This is 1925. Anna Dury is over here. She's hiring some local help. And in midnight, they show up in the cemetery. The ground is all rough from all the exhumations being reburied. And she digs up her son's grave. It's in a coffin. She takes the remains out, puts them in another coffin, reburies the coffin, and disappears.
William Dury is finally buried on August the 22nd, 1925 in St. James Cemetery in Toronto. There he lies today, next to his mother, Anna Dury, the woman who carried out one of the few successful body kidnappings after the Great War. Just as William Dury is finally laid to rest, the boom of the Roaring Twenties is heading for its peak. But some veterans can never find peace in the post-war world. Agar Adamson had been in the war from the first to the last, and nearly every day he wrote his beloved wife, Mabel.
Dear Mabel, today Lieutenant Gao shot badly. 4 men killed, 9 wounded, 2 wounded. Dear Mabel, last night under heavy artillery fire, 5 killed, 11 wounded, machine gun crews buried. Gray was shot badly. Dear Mabel, ever thine. 280 dead Germans still huddled together as they died. Thousands of rats. Dear Mabel, Sladen killed, 10 officer casualties, Pearson shot through lung and spine. Dear Mabel, ever thine. Haggard, Papineau, Sullivan, Allman, all killed today. Well, goodbye, old girl. I am, and hope for a long time to be, your forever loving and devoted. Ever thine, Agar.
Haunted by the shadow of the Great War, Agar is bored by peace. 2 years after returning to Canada, he leaves Mabel, moves to England, and begins a life of hard drinking, late nights, and adventure. In 1929, on a flying stint, Agar crashes into the Irish Sea and catches pneumonia. Within a few months, he is dead. As the funeral salute dies away, Mabel writes to their son.
What I might have done was to have lived with him and let him be happy in his own way. Then the end would have been the same, only I should have no regrets. I always hoped against hope that he would come back to me and lead a simpler life. But it was not to be, and there is a blank in my life that will never be filled.
The veterans of the Canadian Corps, like Agar, are not the only ones obsessed by their wartime past. In Germany, thousands of ex-soldiers, embittered by Germany's defeat, are drawn to a new army-like mass movement, led by the little corporal who had survived the Great War, Adolf Hitler. (1931). Fatally weakened by the Great War, the world economy plunges into depression. Millions lose their jobs, their homes, everything. 1 in 4 veterans is out of work. But Will Bird, who said veterans would never be able to put their feelings into words, survives by writing his own wartime memories. And We Go On is published in 1930. A year later, Maclean's magazine sends Will to Europe to report on the old battlegrounds, 13 years after. He starts at the Belgian city of Ypres, where the Canadians fought their first major battle.
The roads teem with traffic. Bicycles swarm on the paths reserved for them, women riding into Ypres to do their shopping. The whole is a picture of very prosperous farm life, of activity and plenty. But steady your gaze, and you will see thinly hidden the lasting leer of war. It is there in the pillboxes that peep at you from all corners, and in the countless memorials and cemeteries that tell their own story.
Near Ypres, in the sector known as the Ypres Salient, almost 500,000 men were killed, and the unceasing artillery fire had churned tens of thousands of cadavers, men, horses, and mules, deep into the Flanders mud. In his mind, Will Bird is still in the midst of the horror of that fighting.
At noon, we reached an area dotted with derelict tanks. As we rocked one of the monsters, a head squeezed out of the muck. The skin peeled as though from lard, a corpse long dead and frightful. A few yards away were 3 green-scummed pools. White chalky hands reached out of one, and from another, a knee stuck up above the filthy water.
13 years later, Will Bird is strolling over the same ground.
I stopped at a farm to chat with a local farmer. "How goes the farming?" I asked. "Well," he said, "my land is richer than before. It is the best land I have ever seen. My crops are the largest yet." All over those miles you hear the same story. Oh, that blood-soaked region seems doubly productive now.
Leaving behind the battlefields of Ypres, we'll drive south, out of Belgium into France, following the path of the Canadian Corps into the rolling open country of the Somme. And soon he arrives in the fields known as the Graveyard of Armies, where more than 1 million men died.
The Germans still talk of the bloodbath of the Somme, and all the veterans agree that for terrific shellfire, among conditions of mud and water and terrible weather, the Battle of the Somme was only exceeded in dreadfulness by the Battle of Passchendaele. All through the Somme one passes countless cemeteries, British, French, and German, until it seems a great valley of the dead.
In the First World War, the British Empire lost about 1.1 million men, and of that, more than half of them were missing. They decided in an absolutely incredible decision that every name of every soldier and sailor and airman who was killed in the war would be remembered, would be commemorated forevermore. And they decided to build memorials to the missing. This is for all the British Empire, and we're now walking up to the Thiepval Memorial that commemorates 73,000 primarily British soldiers and some South Africans who were missing in the Somme fighting of 1916 and 1917. This is the most enormous and coarse and magnificent monument on the Western Front for what it stands for. It's in a farmer's field, I should say, in the middle of the Somme battlefields. And it's just something so massive about this monument, but yet it lists the names of all the men who have no known grave or who vanished on these fields.
Charlie Recknell got hit by a rifle bullet, quivered, doubled up, and dropped forward, killed instantly. Bobby Bissett crawled upon Recknell and was shot, and lies dead on top of Charlie. Gruzelier was sniping steadily. Just when he's on the point of firing, a bullet got him, and he rolled completely around on his back, stone dead.
These fields are always yielding all sorts of bullets and live shells, but one of the things that surprises most people is how many bones and remains that they yield. During the First World War, one of the sad things about the First World War was so many men were missing. They used to have a phrase, missing, presumed dead, died on or since such and such a date. And what happened in this area here on the Somme is that probably 50 to 60% of the men killed were missing. They never identified them, or they were never found. In France alone, there are 220,000 names on memorials to the missing. And there are 110,000 unknowns buried in the cemetery, which means there are over 110,000 remains in these fields.
One of the missing is Will Bird's younger brother, Stephen. At the outbreak of war in 1914, Stephen Bird volunteered for the 25th Nova Scotia Battalion. In September 1915, he is just south of Ypres, in the line, under German attack. The Germans blow a huge underground mine. 2 men of the 25th are killed, 20 wounded, and 10 reported missing. Stephen Bird is one of them. His body is never found.
It's a long way from Ypres to Mons, and when the trip is done, your memories and thoughts are so commingled that you hardly know the war is history. You see again the long shadowy files on the duckboards of the salient, a silhouette of steel helmets and rifle muzzles. You see long strings of mules taking ammunition. You see in memory the lorries and traffic of the great back areas, sausage balloons, battery positions, trenches that stand to, the gutted wired rat-ridden spaces between the lines. Seeing most, of course, that which impressed you, seared deepest in your brain, whether it was the sleet and shrapnel of Vimy, the bloodbath of the Somme, or the terrible diarrhea of war that was known as Passchendaele.
When Will Bird arrives back in Canada, letters flood into Maclean's magazine. Liberated by Will's articles, grateful veterans can share their memories. But as the world plunges further into the 1930s, the shadows left by the Great War grow darker and darker. In 1934, the world depression reaches new depths, and the sacrifice of the soldiers of the Great War is fast fading from memory. In August, 80,000 veterans, many unemployed, and most feeling betrayed by the world they fought to preserve, gather in Toronto, determined to remind the world of their service and to rekindle the flame of brotherhood. The veterans reaffirm their allegiance to King and Empire. We, the Canadian Corps, in reunion assembled, solemnly reaffirm our loyalty and allegiance to our God, to our King, to our country. Speaking for the veterans, Canon Scott evokes the ideals of the Canadian Corps and the desolate world of the Great Depression.
It was not mere blind patriotism that inspired the men of the Canadian Corps, but the world appeal to uphold justice and liberty and the brotherhood of man. Alas, my comrades, what has happened since? In the world at large, unemployment, poverty, and even starvation. Where is the world that we fought to establish?
1 month after the Toronto rally, other veterans celebrate their success, more than a year in power of one of their own. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
As Adolf Hitler triumphs in Germany, Canadians squabble over the cost of building memorials to their Great War veterans, and even to their greatest victories. It was on Easter Monday, April the 9th, 1917, that the entire Canadian Corps attacked Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge was one of Canada's greatest victories, and as it turned out, one of the crucial battles of the First World War. And it was on Vimy Ridge that the government decided to build the Canadian National Memorial in honor of all the Canadian dead of the Great War.
After the war, a committee got together, including Sir Arthur Currie, and they decided on which Canadian battlefields were going to be commemorated. They felt that Vimy was one of the great victories for sure. It wasn't necessarily the biggest, but it was the best place for Canada's national monument, and that's why the monument's here. To build the monument, they had to clear the old First World War battlefield and build a road system to bring up all the stone, which came from Yugoslavia. So they had to construct this massive road. Of course, there's dugouts and there's literally thousands of shells and, you know, all sorts of stuff. This was a dangerous place after the war. So they had to do that first, and then they started to build the bastion here.
Towering over the highest point of Vimy, the twin pylon design of Toronto artist Walter Allward takes 14 years to build, requires 15,000 tons of concrete, and 6,000 tons of white limestone transported from Yugoslavia. Walter Allward personally oversees all phases of the construction.
They didn't carve any of the statues and bring them in. They carved them here, and that's what's really remarkable. And when you look up the two pylons at the very top, they had to build little studios in situ so that the sculptors could come up and carve them directly into the stone, because they're carved out of one piece. So they had all these studios up there. They had an elevator to take the sculptors up there. And they worked from plaster casts of Walter Alward's work. The original statues are half size and they're plaster. And you can still see them today in Ottawa where they have the caliper marks, where the sculptors working on them were doing their measurements.
After 14 years of controversy and mounting costs, the Vimy Monument is ready for unveiling in 1936. More than 6,000 Vimy pilgrims board specially chartered steamships and sail for France. And on July 26, 1936, more than 100,000 people gather at Vimy for the opening of the memorial to the battle that had taken place almost 20 years before.
One of the men on the tour was my grandfather. He came back to Vimy. He had been here obviously in 1918 when he was wounded, and he came back to give a final statement, I guess, or final visit to the people who he had left behind. For him, it was a very, very big issue, and after he died, we found in his drawers every piece of paper from the Vimy pilgrimage, his special Vimy pilgrimage passport. He had the London Underground schedule for 1935, and he was a clerk in Bell Canada, so at that time he wasn't making much money. So to save up that much money during the Great Depression and to make this trip just shows how important this monument was to those Canadians.
We raise this memorial to Canadian warriors. It is the inspired expression in stone, chiseled by a skillful Canadian hand, of Canada's salute to her fallen sons. In that spirit, I unveil this memorial to Canada's dead.
The Vimy Memorial is Canada's national memorial, but it is also in a special sense the memorial for the 11,285 Canadian soldiers who died in France and whose bodies were never found. One of those vanished soldiers was William Crossland. Will had left his young wife and son at home in Winnipeg, and at the Battle of Courcelette, Will Crossland was one of the first Canadians to go over the top.
Your grandfather was missing in action at Courcelette on September the 15th, 1916. And like most men who were missing, their bodies were never found, and they're commemorated here at Vimy. This is the memorial to the missing.
My grandmother was also given this. I don't know what it is, so maybe you can tell me a bit about what that's all about.
This is called the Next of Kin Memorial Plaque, or was known as the Dead Man's Penny. It was sent to families after the war, 1922, around there. Every family who lost somebody, they would get one of these plaques. And the plaques are unique in that they bear the name of the man who died. So this is an individual commemoration of this particular individual, which is William Crossland. So this is unique to your grandfather.
What do each of the things mean on here, Norm?
Well, you have the figure of Britannia, the British lion for the Empire, the dolphin signifying life. You have the British lion down here killing the German eagle, and he died for freedom and honor, and then with his name here. Well, because your grandfather was missing in action and his body was never found, and he died in France, he's commemorated here at Vimy. So his name is engraved on the wall around the bastion. And we'll just go and try to find it right now.
Yeah, there he is, look. W. William Crossland. So that's all that's left of my grandfather, right? No grave?
No grave. They never found his grave, and that's pretty common for First World War, unfortunately. 1 in 3 has no known grave.
In 1936 at Vimy, most Canadian veterans were able to pay their last respects to their dead comrades and come to terms with their past. But some demons of the Great War are not so easily laid to rest. Only 4 years after the Vimy Memorial is unveiled, another Great War veteran pays it a visit, former German Army Corporal Adolf Hitler. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany once again, as in 1914, invades Belgium and France. And once again, Canadian civilians line up with wooden rifles and set about learning how to be soldiers. And once again, a great flotilla takes them to Europe to fight. By 1944, the Second World War is raging, and Canon Frederick Scott, who survived the First War and feared the coming of the Second, dies and is buried in Montreal on a cold, bitter January day.
My comrades, where is the world we fought to establish? Where are those high principles which drew us, a mighty host, into the furnace of a war, to end all war?
And 6 months later, in June 1944, Canadian troops land with their allies on the beaches of Normandy. It is the first step back to the old battlefields where their fathers had fought in the Great War in Flanders. Once again, as in 1914, Canadian troops help liberate Europe. Hitler's Germany will fall, and with it, one unfinished chapter of the Great War will finally be closed.
We're in Benny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery in Normandy, and we're really looking at one of the legacies of the First World War, one of the saddest legacies of the First World War. For many of the men who survived, their sons would have to come and fight again, here in Normandy and through Europe, Italy, in the air over Germany, and many of them would die. And I think one of the saddest things is that they had to give up their sons. They scraped through themselves, and then to have another generation go off and die in rapid succession like this, with such catastrophic results, must have just been horrific for those men. This is the grave of Captain Stephen Bird, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, killed 8th July 1944, aged 24. The personal inscription reads, "He lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and was loved. His memory remains." You can tell by reading that it was written by a World War I veteran, and his father was Will Bird.
Thy years pass, thy memory remains. Now thousands more are in graves, dead while they should yet be young. Thy years pass, thy memory remains.
Cabaret Rouge Cemetery in northern France, near Vimy Ridge, just one of more than 2,000 First World War cemeteries and monuments strung along the old Western Front. During the 1920s and the 1930s, grieving relatives and friends came and remembered. The cafe at Cabaret Rouge was always full, but today the cafe's gone. Almost no one comes here anymore, except perhaps the occasional passerby.
I started coming across these cemeteries, these immaculate cemeteries, and I was curious as to who these people were. And I started to come across a lot of Canadian graves, fellows killed on the same day. And they were absolutely amazing in the way they preserve the history. They're frozen history, and that's what I found completely fascinating about them.
Halfway across, the first wave seemed to melt, and we were in front headed for Fritz, who was firing wildly and strong. And as the remnants of us were nearing bombing reach, we almost as one dropped into the shell holes. Not a man was moving in no man's land, save the wounded, twisting and groaning in their agony.
The men who came here in 1914, 1915 were British. The men who attacked Vimy Ridge and captured Vimy Ridge were Canadians. And that transition took place in the hearts and souls of the men that were part of the Canadian Corps. And it was their ability, their pride in being members of the Canadian Corps that really created this whole concept of nationalism.
An officer came down and told us that the Germans were in the wood, which we could see before us at some distance in the moonlight. I passed down the line and told them, "It's a great day for Canada, boys." These words afterwards became a watchword, for the men said that whenever I told them that, it meant that half of them were going to be killed.
These men were treated very, very specially, and their sacrifice was important. And that's why you have these unique cemeteries. And that's why you have all these incredible designs and the land seated in perpetuity. And there'd been no war like it, no sacrifice like it, and they commemorated it as such. I think people forget that to get somewhere there is sacrifice. The path of freedom is paved with blood, and people don't recognize that anymore because they have the freedom. They can't relate to the concept of giving your life up for a cause. I think what's odd about history, period, is that you're standing on the ground where so much took place before you. And you can certainly feel the shadows of the Great War here. You know there's ghosts walking out there.